Dines hotia, Edosdi usha, Tahltan didena hotsia esta tehi, Ts'msyen esta tehi, Eskina et kaga te kacha, Tlabana de otsi jasini. First of all, I would like to thank and acknowledge the Tlego'i people upon whose territory the University of Northern British Columbia resides on, for allowing me to share my Tahltan language learning journey. In my language, I shared with you about my name, my nation, my clan, my crest, and the land that my name comes from. My name is Edōsdi, which means someone who raises up pets and children, or someone who is a teacher. Edōsdi is a Ts'msyen name, which comes from the Tlabana territory, one of 3 Ts'msyen areas in our nation. I've made a commitment to myself to identify myself by this name, a name that connects me to my ancestors through our land, language, culture, and worldview. As someone who is learning my language, I have realized it's important to make mistakes, but I want to make sure that I don't let the fear of those mistakes hold me back. In the summer of 2000, Tlego'i, one of my Tahltan elders, I asked her to only speak Tahltan to me, but I also told her how this really scared me, that I was really afraid of making mistakes, but that I knew that being immersed in the language was going to be the only way that I would actually learn the language. Her response to me has affected me in a profound way and has allowed me to let go of some of those fears. What she said to me was, "What have you got to be scared of? It's your spirit in you trying to talk." Learning my language, it's so hard at my age. My brain doesn't want to do all this hard work. And it's still really scary, and I'm really scared to still make mistakes. But I've taken what Tlego'i has said to heart, and I'm working to not be scared to speak my language. And I also need to be brave in learning the language of my ancestors. Now, why do I need to be brave? All learners of languages, especially adults, have a really hard time. But for Indigenous peoples, learning the language of our ancestors, it's so much harder. There's so much shame. There's so much baggage. There's so much responsibility. When I started my journey, I wanted to learn my Tahltan language. But before I started my journey, I always felt like a child around my grandparents, even when I became an adult. But once I expressed my desire to learn my language, Kasha and Ayakta embraced both me and my desire to learn. This is when our relationship changed, and they became my best friends. My grandpa started speaking Tahltan all the time to Granny. And Granny told me how important it was to speak the language with each other all the time in order to teach me. My grandparents loved to tell the story about when my grandpa asked Granny what time it was in the language. So Grandpa called out her name and said, "Kasha, Dugao." Granny said, "Oh, Charlie, do you always have to be speaking the language all the time?" Grandpa, thinking that Granny was acting high tone for not wanting to speak our language, didn't say anything for a few minutes. He then repeated the question, but with one small change. "Estsega, Dugao," which means, "White woman, what time is it?" I always wondered why Granny would get so annoyed with Grandpa for speaking the language all the time, especially since she was the one that said that they needed to do that. I realized her annoyance came from the shame that was imposed on all Aboriginal peoples by Canada's colonial and assimilation policies. The Indian Act was designed to get rid of the Indian problem, with residential schools being used to kill the Indian in the child. So while our language and culture was not passed down, this shame was. My Tahltan grandmother learned her language from her mother, Ts'msyen, and her older sister as well. Only when her dad was away, though, and her dad was of Irish and Dutch descent, and he would be away delivering mail for days and weeks at a time. But once Granny's dad was home more often, her mother stopped speaking the language as much, and so the remaining 8 children didn't learn it fluently. My dad's mother, Kxeen, spoke her Gitxan language fluently, but she only spoke it to people that she was comfortable around. And she definitely didn't teach her children. I didn't even know that my granny spoke her language fluently until after she passed away. When I was growing up, I didn't know that I was Tahltan, but I did know that I was an Indian. I recall when I was going into grade 1, I was playing in the front yard with my sisters. I was tall and skinny, I had long braids, and a girl new to the neighborhood walked up to me and asked, "Are you an Indian?" I didn't know what to say because I didn't even know what an Indian was at that point. Now, why didn't I know that I was Tahltan, or for that matter, an Indian? We didn't learn about it at school, and we didn't discuss it at home. And as I got older, I realized being an Indian was something you just did not want to be. As a young adult in university, one of my friends asked me about my ethnicity. I recall hesitating and then saying, Irish, Dutch, Scottish, Norwegian, and Native. I still remember how my voice trailed off quietly, ending that sentence. I felt ashamed to be Aboriginal, but I didn't even know why. And I felt ashamed for being ashamed. My dear friend and colleague, the late Tlego'i, has said, "Our people used to be ashamed to speak our languages. Now we're ashamed because we don't speak our languages." With all 34 First Nations languages in British Columbia being endangered, what do we lose as human beings when a language is no longer spoken? And to play the devil's advocate, why don't we just speak one language, the same language? Anthropologist Dr. Wade Davis has answered this question. And to paraphrase Wade, great idea. But let's let that language be Tahltan, or Gitxan, or Dekelth. Wade, who has a home in Tlego'i territory, where my name comes from, which is also called the Sacred Headwaters, has said, "Every language is an old-growth forest of the mind, a watershed of thought, an entire ecosystem of spiritual possibilities." I've been learning my Tahltan language for the past 25 years, and I've also been a teacher, trying to live up to my name Edōsdi for that length of time. For the past 7 years, I have had the honor and pleasure of being the director of my nation's language reclamation program. Our language team works to create programming and language learning materials, but more importantly, to create safe spaces for learners and speakers to flourish and thrive. Our work focuses on the revitalization and preservation of our language. I see revitalization as creating new speakers, providing opportunities for people to speak the language in immersion settings, and as well for new learners and language speakers to thrive. I compare this to flourishing berry bushes, Iskut, soapberries. For preservation, this is the documentation of the language. This is where we develop language learning materials like grammar guides, dictionaries, creating new recordings, all the tools of language learning. I compare this to the jarring of Iskut. If we only work at preserving the berries, then we will no longer have any berries flourishing and living alive. This is similar to languages. If we do not create immersion settings, we will have no more speakers. I originally thought that I was learning my language in order to learn who I am as a Tahltan person, but as well to live up to my name Edōsdi. But my mother, Dzidza, and my grandparents made me realize it was more than that. We were driving through inland Tlingit territory, And we decided to stop in the museum in Ts'msyen, where work that was being exhibited by our relative, Dr. Dempsey Bob, a Tahltan Tlingit master carver. My mom turned to her mother and teased her and said, "Why are you so interested in all this Indian stuff now? You never taught us when we were growing up." Granny turned to her and said, "Ever since my granddaughter has made me feel proud to be Tahltan." I remember feeling a lump in my throat and tears welling up in my eyes. From learning my language, I have felt the shame of being Indian beginning to lift. And my journey has helped not only me, but my family in becoming proud of who we are. My grandpa would talk about going to potlatches in Drytown, in Tlego'i, in Telegraph Creek, when he was a young boy. He said Granny's uncle, Meninzaat, would open the potlatches speaking in the Tlingit, Kaska, and Niska languages, even if our neighbors weren't there, and even before he spoke Tahltan. My grandpa said this showed just how much respect we had for other nations and for their languages. My wish is for all of us to have that same respect, to have an awareness of whose lands we live upon, but as well, having an awareness of their languages, awareness of their languages and their cultures in order to show that respect that my grandpa spoke of. There are 60 Indigenous languages in 11 language families on the lands that we now call Canada. The revitalization and reclamation of these languages can help to raise up all Canadians, Indigenous and non-Indigenous alike. My passion for learning my language is important to me, not only on a personal level and a community level, but also on a global level. Utlan dena, usinsan, ueta, tligatanez sa, estzaga kosti hedi, kujimendi tligatanez kat ahuja. In my language, I'm quoting my dear friend Tlatlakul, who has said, "I've heard lots of people say, one day I'm going to learn my language. Well, you know, one day is here." Tlan Madu. Thank you very much.